Hello and welcome to the Quarantined Wild Gamer. I'm Big Lee, and this week I'm going to be following on from last week's video with my Anglo-Zulu War game of Rorke'sDrift using the Men Who Would Be Kings rules. So in last week's video I discussed a little bit about the history, it's a very potted version of the history, the background, what led up to this particular battle. I discussed my terrain options, and as I said, everyone's terrain is always going to be an interpretation of the various maps available, and mine's no different. So I talked a little bit about the terrain that I was using and how I positioned it, and then I spent a bit of time talking about some of the house rules I was introducing to make the Men Who Would Be Kings work with my 6mm collection at for this particular battle. So although I may use some of those house rules again in future games, I designed them specifically for this scenario, so I can swap them around if I feel I need them. Having done all that, it's now time to start rolling some dice and to let chance decide the fate of the British. Will they hold out? Will history get repeated? Or will the Zulus be victorious this time? The game will commence when the Anglo-Zulu War regiment, the young unmarried men with their black shields, arrives, and they immediately go into the assault first. The other regiments will come in later in the battle. As with my earlier games, for movement and ranges, I'm using centimetres rather than inches, and other than that the numbers are the same, so works better with 6mm and still looks reasonably realistic. So the Zulus can move 8 centimetres, so that's them moving forward. And they're going to move up close behind. So that should put them within rifle range of the British defenders. I'm going to do a couple of turns of that, and then we'll come back and I can talk about what's going on. So now that the game is underway, I've taken the thatch roofs off the top of the buildings and put the troops inside that will be defending those buildings. So in the case of the hospital, we've got a mix of members of the 1st and 2nd Battalion, so there's wounded men, but I'm going to treat them as the same stats as regular units because they put some fit troops in there as well, and actually many of the wounded were minor ailments that would have relieved them of duty but wouldn't really have reduced their fighting effectiveness. So there are effectively 3 units there and an NCO, and inside the storeroom I've got a couple of units who will probably direct their fire against the hill. So that's the positions. The Zulus have moved. It's now time for Zulu firing, and then we'll go over to the British. So the Zulus up in the hill here. I've got an excellent view down on the site. I've slightly improved the range of their weapons so that they can actually reach the site, because if they were using the prescribed obsolete rifles, they would only have 18 centimetres, which would only just hit that building. I've given them slightly better so that they can hit the rest of the site if needs be, but 18 will actually reach the storehouse. But because they're shooting at targets in hard cover, they actually need to get 3 hits to take off a casualty, and I've just rolled the 16 dice and I only managed to get 1 hit, so actually that has no effect whatsoever. I don't want the shooting to massively adversely affect the outcome of the game. Although there were several wounds inflicted by rifle shots during the battle, there's only a handful of people that were actually killed by rifle fire from the hill, mainly because the accuracy of the antiquated guns they were using, some of them even as old Bram Besses and old muskets from before the Napoleonic Wars, they were only accurate up to about 50 yards, and these guys were firing 200-300 yards. So if they hit a target, it was more luck than judgment. So I don't really want those men up there. I want them to be an annoyance and a bit of harassment, but I don't, they might cause a casualty or 2 during the course of the game, but I don't want it to be a game changer because it wasn't in the battle itself. So now it's the turn of the British to the return fire. Now, I'm not going to count the fire of this unit, although according to the rules they could get an arc. I'm going to leave them out for this turn, but that still leaves 4 bases that I can say have got some sort of line of sight on the approaching Zulus and can fire, plus 2 NCOs. And I'm going to roll for Chard because he's also here, so I'm going to give him a dice as well. He will roll the same as all of them. They're going to hit on a 5+. So that's 16 dice for the 4 bases, because I'm going to roll 1 dice for each figure, plus an extra dice for each of the NCOs and a special dice for Chard. Let's say he's going to roll the same as the rest, but I just want to be able to see whether he manages to take out a target. So according to my maths, that's 16, 17, 18, 19 dice. And then what I'll do is I will spread the casualties evenly across those front 3 units rather than targeting one. Okay, 5s and more. So it's 2. Chard doesn't hit. 3, 4, 5. 6 hits, so it's going to be 2 against each, and now I'll do a pin test to see whether those units are pinned. So I'll just mark them there, so that's 2 each, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do for marking off casualties. So to mark casualties off, I'm using small dice, so I'll mark how many casualties a particular unit has. Now normally I would use a little dice holder and put them in there, but there's not room because there's so many units. So rather than do that, I'm going to not use those. I'm going to just little blue tack the little dice. There's a name bit bar at the back of the base, and there's enough room there to blue tack the dice on, and I can use up to 3 dice to mark off all 16 casualties if necessary. All 3 units took some casualties, which mean they all get to roll for pinning. 2 of the units passed okay, but this unit didn't, so this is going to be pinned. And I've changed my markers for this game. I'm just going to use a red marker to indicate that that unit is pinned, and I'll put a second one on if it's doubly pinned, and so on. So basically they're going to stay in their position and need to do a rally next turn, but the unit behind them can pass through on its move. It can pass through friendly troops, so the fact that there's 2 layers of units there means that the Zulus will still be able to continue to move forward, although already their nice block of troops has been slightly disrupted by British fire. There's probably at least another 1 or 2 turns of movement before they reach the buildings. So a little bit of smoke being put down to show that the British have fired all across their line, mostly against the approaching Zulu regiment, but also the men in the storehouse have fired up against the Zulus at the bottom of the hill. Because the Zulus are in soft cover, hiding behind bushes and so on, you need 2 kills to hit them, so the British managed to hit 2. It's only 8 men firing, but obviously much more accurate rifle firing, and they managed to do 1 casualty against the Zulus up there. So that was a good result for the British there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to play through this assault, and then I will just video the bits when we get to crucial moments, because if I'm doing every dice roll for the entire game, this video will be about 3 hours long, and I want to try and keep it a little bit shorter if I can. So there you go, the opening movements and the opening shooting, and I'll come back to this in a minute when a little bit more has happened. Oh, it's worth adding that the unit that has been pinned and can't be moved, as I say, the unit behind it can move through it, but because of the size and the way that I've based my figures, the only way that that unit behind it would be able to get in front was if it could move a lot more than its normal 8 centimetres. So what I'm doing is I'm moving the pinned unit back slightly so that the unit that passes through it only moves the 8 centimetres it's allowed, and then shifting the other unit back slightly just to accommodate the 2 bases. A bit of a fudge because of the way that I've based my troops, but it still replicates the fact that that other unit has been pinned and can't move, and therefore the nice neat formation is slowly being broken up. On the way in, 2 Zulu units took very heavy fire and were pinned, but they've now been leapfrogged by the units behind them, and these units are now within charge range of the what we know as the hospital and the back of the site, and these units haven't taken any damage yet. Meanwhile, the first unit that pinned has rally saved and will be able to move as normal from next turn. But you can see these two are now pinned and have taken 6 casualties each, so they're taken quite a significant number of casualties already. Up on the hill, the British managed to kill another Zulu up there, but in return, in a lucky dice roll, they have managed to kill a British trooper from section 4. So I've marked that off with a dice down there. The first British casualty, surely it won't be the last, particularly now as the Zulus are in a position to actually get into combat and start attacking the hospital. So the Zulus have managed to make contact. 2 units have managed to get to the front or to the rear wall of the hospital, and that part of the back barricade. And one of the other units has lapped around, and this is exactly what happened. They sort of lapped around that corner and slowly realised that actually it was easier to attack from this side. So I expect to see more of that. Meanwhile, over in the back, this unit passed its rally save, also will be able to move again next turn. This unit failed and had to retreat for centimetres. So not all of the weight of that rather large Zulu unit regiment has managed to get in, but those units will slowly come into the fight over the next couple of turns. So I'm going to resolve the combats in and around the hospital, and then I'll come back to you in a moment and tell you what's happened. So the Zulus managed to get up to the back of the hospital, but as they've all 3 of those units have moved more than half their move to reach that the barricades, I am allowing the British to have a reaction. So in other words, they get to fire. They will need to pass a leadership test in order to do so. So I'm going to do a quick dice roll. Yep. Both of the units involved will be able to respond. So they're going to get reaction fire as the Zulus come in. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up. So these 2 units, although this unit here is not going to be able to take part in the melee, it will be able to get a shot off as the Zulus come in. So these 2 units and their associated officers will fire against this Zulu unit. These 2 units inside the hospital will fire against that one. And these 2 and the one out there and their officers will shoot at these guys. I'm going to say no, because the Zulus are going to end up in a position where they're not in the fire arc of that base, so I'm not going to allow that. So nice and simple, 8 dice plus NCOs and officers against each of the units. So I'm going to roll for that and then we'll come back. So first I'm going to start at this end, so that's going to be 8 dice, 1 NCO and a Bromhead, all needing 5s or more to hit, and because the Zulus are in the open, it's 1 hit per kill. So I'm going to roll these. I'm sorry it's going to be outshot, but that is 5 kills. Right, that's pretty devastating. I'm going to put them behind that unit so we know which ones have fired. Crikey. 2 fires against 2 units rather, and their NCO against this one. So again, it's going to be 8 dice and an extra 1 for the NCO. Again, needing 5s. Okay, British fire. 4 kills against that one on the way in. They won't require a pinning test because they are charging. That would just be, I think, a little bit too much in favour of the British, I think. And then over here, 2 bases and 1 NCO, and I'll allow Bromhead to take part. He fires on a 4+, he hits rather on a 4+, everyone else on a 5+. So let's roll against this Zulu unit, and that is going to be, crikey O'Reilly. Okay, Bromhead misses, but the rest of the unit does 6 hits. So although I'm not going to, let's zoom out slightly. So although I'm not going to make those units make pinning tests for that fire as they charge in, it will of course affect their ability in how many dice they roll when they do their melee. So I will put dice on them in a second to show how many casualties done, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to resolve the melees first, because then I'll add up all of the casualties that they've taken and then put dice on the base to represent that. But that has done a significant amount of damage to those Zulu units at the point at which they're hitting, and will give the British a chance, basically. It doesn't mean to say that the Zulus can't come back for more, but they're going to take quite a lot of damage. I mean, they were literally dashing themselves against the barricades for much of this battle, and the fighting was vicious. And although that the Zulus are excellent hand-to-hand warriors, experts with their assegai, the reality was they were facing troops who were just as expert with their bayonets, and a bayonet on the end of a Martini Henry rifle gave the British an extra couple of foot of reach. Those bayonets were 18 inches long. On the end of a rifle, it gave them much more reach than a Zulu assegai, and for much of the site the British had a slight height advantage, and of course they were fighting from behind those barricades, so the British had a lot of advantages in this fight. So although it looked and felt desperate, and the film makes it look incredibly desperate, the British were in a very strong position indeed, which is why Cetshwayo told his men never to attack a fortified British position. He knew it was suicide, and that the casualties would not warrant any strategic advantage. Not that there was any strategic advantage in destroying the mission station at Rorke'sDrift. Literally, these Zulus went after it for the glory. So I resolved the melee, and the Zulus were defeated, taking significant casualties. I've put some casualties, added the casualties to those they took with the fire on the way in. And then I've arranged the units back. They've been pushed back 4 centimetres rather. They all had to take a pinning test. Amazingly, only one failed, so he's now pinned. But because the British troops have been engaged in a melee and had their reaction fire, they're not going to be able to fire as well this turn. So it's back to the Zulus' turn. With the exception, the troops in the storehouse are still going to be able to fire, and of course other troops that weren't involved would be able to fire, but they've got no targets at the moment. So I'm just going to resolve the fire from the storehouse over here against the men in the hills, and then we'll go back to the Zulus' moves. But those Zulu units have taken quite a lot of casualties so far. But the British haven't come off completely unscathed. Section number 1 has taken a casualty. The men in the hospital, unsurprisingly, have taken 3 casualties. If I lose another, I'll actually take the base off. Number 4 section, which includes 1 man from in the storehouse, 1 base from within the storehouse, they've now taken a combined total of 2 casualties. I'm just going to do a little bit of admin, so I've got some sheets that I'm going to update so I can keep track of everything, and then we will resume the Zulus' turn. Zulus continue their assault on the rear of the hospital, but now some of those units that were left behind are starting to come up. So the units at the front, the Zulus at the front, have obviously taken a lot of casualties, but they're still able to fight, and of course while they're doing that, they're shielding the units behind them. A relatively fresh unit has managed to come in over here, and they're starting to lap around the side of the site. Meanwhile, the Unthuluwela and the Undlako have arrived on the scene and have started to move. They can see that the front of the mission station is actually the weak point, despite the formidable looking barricades, and so they are going to proceed to try and move around using the soft cover to get round to the front of the site. So the Zulus continue their attack despite their mounting casualties. Some of those units are moving more than half their moves, so the British get another reaction fire, but there's less British. They've taken casualties as well. A couple of bases of troops have gone off, and some of the remainders have still got casualties to marked off. So yeah, it's not an entirely one-sided fight. So over here, this base and Bromhead are going to get to fire on this unit, so that's going to be 4 dice plus Bromhead's dice. He's going to fire on a 4+, the British on the other troops on a 5+ against this unit as a reaction, and they do 2 casualties. So I'll put the 2 casualties there for now just to mark them, so you can see them there, because then they'll be added to from whatever happens in the melee. This unit obviously isn't getting into melee, so that's a different matter, but this unit did manage to get into melee. We'll get up to the barricades. Again, it's going to be fired on by another base and an NCO, so again 4 dice. The black dice is the NCO, but he fires the same as the regular troops on a 5+. Okay, so that is another 2 hits. Again, I'm not doing pins for reaction fire. These men are, the Zulus are charging in, their blood's up, their adrenaline's flowing. They're not going to get pinned by this reaction fire. Over here, again, another unit is charging in, coming back again towards the rear of the hospital. They know they've managed to kill some of the defenders, so they're pressing home their attack. Again, I'm going to allow 4 dice and an NCO to fire on them on the way in, because they're the ones directly in front of them. So again, 5s. That time only 1 hit. So put that dice there just to represent that 1 hit for the time being. Now this unit, unfortunately, it's charging in, it's going to get reaction fire, but it's made itself exposed to 3 units. So actually it's going to take quite a lot of fire, this particular one, because it's directly in front of it. So what we've got is 3 men are off of this unit to start with. Sorry, 3 off of unit 4, so that's 1 dice less per base, because there's 3 bases at the moment. So I'm going to allow 3 dice for that base, 4 dice for that base, 4 dice for that base, plus an NCO. So that's quite a lot of dice there. Again, I'm going to need 5s. So I'm going to roll these. I'll roll these over here so you can sort of see them. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So they got off fairly lightly considering the amount of dice being lobbed in their direction. So that's 4 off of that unit. I'll mark all that out in a second. But they've taken quite a lot of damage in that final charge in, but they're still pressing home their attack. So I'm going to change up the bases, the dice bases, to show how many casualties, and then we will resolve the melee. So I put the casualties on for that receiving that reaction fire from the British. As you can see, this particular unit's taken a hell of a lot. It's down to 2 men and its leader. Instantly, I have been rolling for leader kills. You know, and every time a unit takes casualties, you have to roll, and if you get double 1, their leader is killed. So far, miraculously, nobody has lost any leaders, and likewise I've been rolling for British saves on the, you know, the as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to do saves on the British wounded, the Surgeon Reynolds effect. Has he managed to save them? And so far I haven't rolled a single 6, so not a single British casualty has been recovered. So it almost seems like introducing that rule is a bit pointless. Maybe it's just the dice, but it hasn't had any effect on the game so far. So now I'm going to resolve the melee, and things are getting a bit tight for everyone. I'm not sure that the Zulus can pull this off here now, certainly not with the units at the front, because they've got so few men. I mean, this unit, I say, it's reduced to 2 men and its leader. This one's going to be reduced to 9 men and its leader. Again, 8 men. So you know, their effectiveness is becoming less and less of each wave of attack on the walls. So that Zulu assault was repulsed again. 1 unit was entirely destroyed. This unit was pushed back over here, but didn't fail its pin save, so it's okay, although it's taken heavy casualties. This unit over here came the closest, causing 1 casualty against the British, and the British caused 1 casualty back. So it just got pushed back without having to take the pin save. But now all of the Zulu units of this regiment have taken a lot of damage, and one part of it has actually been removed. However, in the meantime, over here, reinforcements are starting to arrive, and they're step by step they're pushing round to the front of the site. Meanwhile, the British defenders have been losing men slowly, but nonetheless they've been losing men. This unit is now been severely weakened. It's lost one base and there's another 3 casualties to come off of that, so it's in quite a bad shape. There's another casualty there, and they've been again reduced to 2 bases inside the hospital, so that unit's effectiveness has been significantly reduced, but it may have seen off that assault by the Zulus. Meanwhile, of course, the roof is now on fire and smoke is starting to fill the hallways. Thankfully, it rained heavily the last few days and the thatch is taking its time to catch. But nonetheless, the men inside realise that at some point they're going to have to get out of here. Meanwhile, the men in the storehouse have continued to exchange fire with the Zulus up on the bottom of the hill. They've managed to inflict 3 casualties on that Zulu unit up there, and without taking any more casualties on themselves, but nonetheless there's been a steady exchange of fire going on throughout the game, keeping each other occupied. But it's very much a minor part of the battle. The real fight, as historically, is for the end of the compound and the hospital. As I say, smoke is now starting to come out of the thatch, and they're realising that their position is looking a little bit tenuous. They're also now aware of more reinforcements arriving, although they're currently unable to target them, and they're not yet part of the fight. But nonetheless, they can see these Zulu reinforcements starting to arrive over here. The Indaluyangwe regiment is nearly spent. This is probably their last ditch attempt to assault this end and the hospital. They've managed to get in, and what I've done is I've used little green markers to indicate those units that are going to take reaction fire. They're actually just the other side of the red markers that I've been using for pins, just painted different colours on each side. So there's 3 units that are going to take some reaction fire from the British. Some of the Zulus managed to get in without being fired upon. Meanwhile, the new fresh, the Unduloko and the Ufuluana regiments are working their way around the flank, using the cover and the fight that's already occurring. Their colleagues already in the fight, to work our way around, and then they're going to launch their assault on the front of the site, which looks as if it's going to be better, because obviously they're going to have more cover and take less in the form of fire from those formidable British guns. The Martini Henry was quite a formidable weapon when you think that they were fighting men whose only protection was a cowhide shield, and a Martini Henry would fire a 45 caliber bullet, which would make a pretty nasty wound, particularly at close range. You know, as I've mentioned a couple of times, the British got through the best part of 20,000 rounds during the course of the battle, and you know, many of the Zulu casualties were from bullet wounds, but also from that formidable bayonet. Once they got up to there in melee, the Zulus had very little fear of being shot. They'd been told by you know, had spells read over them, and their rituals had said that they were invulnerable to British bullets, despite the evidence of seeing their friends and so on falling around them. But they had a real fear of the bayonet. You know, several accounts showed that the Zulus found that going up against the British with the bayonet were quite jittery about it, and indeed they were equally matched in terms of ability. You know, and as I mentioned earlier, the Martini Henry with an 18-inch bayonet on the end gave the British a significant reach advantage in melee. So it's not entirely surprising that the Zulus had a really hard time getting across these prepared defences when the British were able to lean over and stab them before the Zulus could even get close enough with the assegai. And it says a lot for the bravery of the Zulus that they kept pressing those attacks despite their obvious mounting casualties, and their utter exhaustion. By this stage in the battle, we're looking at about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. It's starting to get dark. You know, normally they wouldn't fight in the dark, but it's now dusk. They've been marching and then fighting all day, so it's amazing that they've still got the stamina to go on. Well, that was a dramatic round of melee. The Zulus charged in. They took quite a lot of fire, reaction fire from the British, but they still managed to close the gap and get into melee. Over here, the Zulus have forced the men out of those rooms facing the outside of the back of the hospital. And what I've done is, because the building itself was made up of a jumble of rooms with no interconnecting corridors, and the men were literally hacking holes in the walls to move from one room to the next. The British have been pushed back to the end of the hospital, and the Zulus are inside, so they're now fighting inside the building of the hospital. But they've taken casualties. There's literally down to a handful of men now inside, and their NCO trying to keep them fighting. The other units were pushed back. The Zulu units were pushed back, but again, section number 1 has taken a lot of damage. It's down to just 5 men and its NCO. Over here, the Zulus charged in. They took some fire on the way in, but they were still able to get into a fight, and it was a stalemate, 2 casualties each. So the Zulus have been pushed back, but again, you've got the body of all the supporting troops are starting to come in around the back end of the table here, round to the front of the site, and so you're going to see some attacks up the front soon. So the Zulus are inside the hospital. The end of the compound is starting to become untenable. There's smoke pouring out of the roof of the hospital, and the few men that are left inside and the patients now need to be evacuated. It's getting close to the point where the British are going to have to make a decision whether they're going to continue to try and hold this end of the battlements. The Anglo-Zulu regiments throws themselves again at the barricades, attacking on all sides, but they're attacking so many casualties now that their effectiveness has been reduced to the point where they haven't been able to break through. The British have been reduced in numbers, but again the Zulus have been thrown back, and this time they've all been pinned in the effect. So the British have got an opportunity here to pull back safely if they wish to, which I think that's what I may well do. So there's probably going to be at least one round of sort of reconsolidation of the British and movement, and those Zulus are probably giving up. They're probably not going to fight much more. They might pull back. It's starting to get dusk, so they ain't going to have to pull back far to be able to take advantage of the dark to consolidate. Use that consolidation rule that I wanted to introduce. So there you go. Crucial moment at the end by the hospital. The hospital's now fully ablaze, and the men are going to have to abandon it anyway. And now we're nearly ready for, so that's pretty much the end of phase 1 of the battle. Phase 2 is probably going to be in a separate video, because this one's gone on quite a long time, but I'm really enjoying it. It's working out very, very close to history, so really good. Well, this is shaping up to be a really good game. I'm certainly enjoying myself. I'm really pleased with how the reaction fire rule that I've introduced seems to be playing out. It doesn't feel like it's unbalanced the rules in any way. Indeed, it's made this particular scenario workable. So I'm really pleased with that. A little bit disappointed that the Surgeon Reynolds rule hasn't come into play yet, but that's simply down to, you know, incredibly bad dice rolling. I haven't managed to save a single British casualty yet. That may well change in the second half of the game. And of course, we've now reached a point where new Zulu regiments have arrived on the scene, and I'm going to play out, see what happens with them. And next week we'll conclude the game. That second major assault on the barricades at the front of the site will begin, and we'll see what happens. Will the British be able to hold out, or will the game change history? Will the Zulus be victorious this time? So again, I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave some comments below, and please dial in next week, next Friday. I'll put out the last part, the concluding part of my Rorke'sDrift game using the men who would be kings.